I shall start by telling you, my grandmother is a witch. She first told me this when I was a child. As I grew older, the belief that I once had faded. It wasn't until she was on her deathbed, when she gave me the key, would I once again believe. No, that I would know she had told me the truth. The call came from my mother early on a Sunday morning. My grandmother had had a heart attack, and she was in the hospital. I quickly threw on my clothes, slipped on my winter boots, hopped in the car, and headed for the hospital. My grandmother and I were very close though, and I hadn't seen her in a few weeks. I was planning on visiting her in the up-and-coming week, but now that idea was entirely struck from my mind. I had to go to her now. When I arrived at the hospital, my father was waiting for me in the lobby. He pulled me in, hugging me tightly. I could tell that he wasn't handling his mother's condition very well. Seeing him this way caused a few tears to run down my face, completely stripping me of my will to hold myself together. Upon entering her room, she was asleep. There was an IV in her arm, and she was hooked up to a heart monitor. I looked at the screen. Her heartbeats were slow, spaced out. I grabbed a chair from the other side of the room, and I moved it to her bedside. I sat, looking at her for a moment, and began to cry quietly. Seeing her this way broke my heart, and I wanted nothing more than for my grandmother to get well again. Some time passed before she opened her eyes. She looked at me, a slight smile gracing her face. Slowly, she reached out her hand. I quickly met her with both of mine and held hers tight. "I'm so glad you came, darling." "They couldn't keep me away, even if they tried," I replied, smiling, a few tears rolling down my cheek. My grandmother looked at my parents, who were standing by the door. "Would you mind giving John and I a moment? I must tell him something very important." My parents nodded in agreement and exited the room, closing the door quietly behind them. She looked back to me. "John, I am going to die." I shut my eyes, trying to hold back more tears from rushing out of me. "Don't say that, Grandma. You're gonna get better. I know you will." She shook her head slightly. "John, my time is coming. Nobody lives forever. At least my life was well lived, and I had such a great grandson to keep me company. There is something I must ask of you, something that must be done. Can you promise me you'll do it?" "Anything, Grandma. What is it?" My voice cracked a bit as the urge to cry again came over me. She pulled her hand away and reached into the pocket of her hospital gown. She pulled out an unusual-looking key. Taking my hand, she placed the key gently on my palm and wrapped her hand around mine. "The key is for the woods," she began. "Do you remember the forest that we used to walk through when you were younger?" I nodded my head, yes. "Do you remember the tree that had been painted on?" I nodded yes. "You must go to that tree, unlock the hidden door, and enter it. You'll find yourself in a strange and unusual place, my home. Follow the path to its end. There will be a hut. Inside the hut, an urn. I wish for you to bring it back here, to your parents. Your father will understand. Okay, Grandma. I'll get it for you. You should go, John. You have a long journey ahead of you, and I must get some rest. I stood up and I kissed my grandmother's forehead. She turned onto her back and closed her eyes. As I exited the room, I was met with a hug from my mother. She tried to assure me that my grandmother would be fine, but I knew she wouldn't. I knew her time in this world was coming to an end, and as sad as that made me, I knew she would finally be at rest. I didn't want her to go, but the will of nature has no rival. 30 minutes later, I arrived at the edge of the woods. I had been here so many times when I was younger, but something about this time made it feel as if it was the first. I exited my car and rummaged through my pockets for the key my grandmother had given me, making sure that I didn't misplace it. I opened up the trunk and pulled out an old navy blue sweatshirt my father had gotten me a year or so back for Christmas. The deeper into the woods that I went, the colder it got. I zipped up my sweatshirt and pulled my sleeves over my hands, hugging myself. As I wandered, I looked for the tree that had been painted on. It was maybe an hour or so before I found not one, but 2 painted trees. Both trees were painted in vibrant colors: blue, green, yellow, orange, and pink. This tree had always been the only painted one, so I never bothered to remember which tree along the path it specifically was. Now that there were 2 trees painted very closely, I couldn't for the life of me remember which one I'd grown up visiting with my grandmother. I looked back and forth at the painted trees. It then occurred to me, the tree my grandmother was talking about would be the one with some kind of keyhole. I picked a tree and began combing over it. I traced my fingers along the bark, looking for some kind of indication of a hole. There, at the base of the trunk, a hole in the paint. I knelt down, took out the key, and inserted it. When I twisted it, I heard a pop from the other side of the tree. When I peeked around the corner to see what it was, a small door had cracked itself open. I crawled into the tree. It was dark. I felt around me to see if there was some kind of a second door, or maybe even a light. The door that I entered through suddenly had closed. Panicking, I began throwing myself against it, desperately trying to free myself. In an instant, I began to fall. It was as if the ground underneath me had given way. I was falling through utter darkness. After a moment of this, a bright light appeared, blinding me. As I slowly opened my eyes, I realized that I was somewhere completely different. I looked above me only to see sky. I looked down and around me. The world beneath me looked magical. Plants I had never seen, in vibrant colors I had never thought possible in nature. Animals grazing in a field that were more beautiful than any others. Just beneath me, a shimmering purple pond. It didn't even hurt when I hit the surface. After swimming back up and making my way to land, I took a moment to look around and admire the beauty that lay before me. A path of finely placed golden bricks lay in front of me. The path my grandmother told me to follow, I thought to myself. The walk wasn't long. Minutes passed by and a small hut came into view. The roof was made of twigs, orange and yellow leaves, and vines. The walls were made of what it appeared to be pink clay. The door was a beautifully carved dark brown wood, with a stained glass window near the top. Entering the hut, I was met with the pleasant smell of freshly baked cookies. I looked around to see if anyone was here, but the place was empty. I looked around for the urn, finding it in a small bedroom in the back. It sat on a bedside table made entirely of glass. I picked it up, looked over it, and made my way back towards the front door. Back outside, I noticed that the grass and bushes along the path were beginning to die. Leaves on nearby trees began to turn brown. I looked back to the hut. I don't know how, but it was starting to melt. Suddenly, the roof caved in. As it did, a loud growl came from the woods behind the hut, followed by footsteps that shook the ground. I didn't know how to leave this place, but I figured maybe I could hide somewhere by the lake that I had fallen into. I began running back up the path. Once at the lake, I looked around for a place to hide. Seeing nothing that would shelter me, I dove into the lake. I peeked my head up to see what had startled me back at the hut. It was a very tall and fat, blue-furred bear, walking on its back legs. It was at least 15 feet tall. It spotted me. I turned to swim to the other side of the pond. I turned to look back at the bear, just as it was getting into the water. I hopped out and ran. The ground began to shake. I turned back to see the bear running on all fours. Turning back in the direction that I was running, I slammed into a tree and fell to the ground. As I scurried back to my feet, a figure in long gray rags emerged from the tree that I had run into. The stranger's hair was long and white. In their left hand was a long wooden stick with a glowing red gem jammed into the top. The stranger moved in front of me, the bear still running full speed at us. Slowly, the stranger lifted the stick and slammed it into the ground. There was a bright flash of red from the gem. When it faded, the bear had stopped right in front of us and was sitting, panting with its tongue out. The stranger turned to me. It was a woman. Her face was wriggly and her nose stuck out unusually far. She smiled at me and then reached out her hand to me. I took her hand and she helped me to my feet. "Thank you." "Anything for Mary's family," the old woman replied. "How did you know that I'm related to Mary?" The woman laughed. "You have her eyes. She's your grandmother, correct? You'd be older to be her son." "Yeah. She asked me to grab this urn from the hut and bring it to my father." I handed her the urn that I had been hugging like a football while running. The woman let out a sigh, her eyes sadly looking over the urn. "Is she sick?" "Yes," I replied. "Is she comfortable?" "Yes." The woman let out another sigh before forcing a smile onto her face. "All right. How's about we get you home then? This place is not meant for someone like you, even being Mary's grandson. Take my hand." I grabbed her hand. She turned and said goodbye to the large blue bear, which she called Cuddles. With the tap of her stick and a red flash of the gem on top, we were back in the woods, standing between the two painted trees. Alrighty then. You tell your grandmother I said hello, and goodbye. I will. May I ask something before you go? Yes. The hut. When I left it, it began to melt and the roof caved in. The trees, bushes, and grass all began to die. What caused it? Was it the bear? Cuddles, I mean. No. You see the other tree with paint on it? She pointed her stick at it. I nodded yes. That tree has a similar door, opened by the same key. It brings you to a sort of parallel to where we just were, only much worse. Your grandmother and I spent the last 50 years keeping its horrors from merging into our lands. But now that she is dying, our guard is weakened. Be glad you didn't enter that place. If you were terrified of Cuddles, you would surely die of shock just stepping into that place. I looked at the painted tree opposite. A quick sensation of fear rushed through me. If I had picked that tree, I would be dead, just like that. What will you do to fight it without my grandmother? Nothing. I will abandon our home and move to a new forest, find another witch, and prepare for the inevitable. Its return. She looked blankly at the dirt for a moment, and then back up to me. She nodded her head, turned, and began to walk away. Just as I had turned to walk away, the woman shouted to me, "Tell this to your grandmother for me. Death is not the end, but a new start. May you take the universe's hand, and may he lead you into the infinite." I turned to the woman and asked what that had meant, but she was gone.